Hello, welcome to Adventures in Miniature. My name is John, this is my teeny tiny hobby room, and I'm going to be painting up this Sisters of Battle model in the order of the Bloody Rose. First off, I like to paint in sub-assemblies. I feel like it helps me get into all the difficult to reach spots without having to constantly touch everything up all the time. I started with a base coat of black, and I'm going to go over all the parts that I want to eventually be red with Rhinox hide, which I think is going to give me some good natural shadows in the details. When I first started using it, I thought it was going to be too dark for anything, but now I love using it to undercoat anything that's going to be brown or red. While the brown is drying, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to set up my base so it's got a chance to dry properly. Next, I'm going to work on the inside of the habit, which needs to be white, so in order to avoid the agony of repeated coats of white paint, I'm going to base this in Mechanicus Grey and work up. With red, I like to work through 3 shades, starting with Corn Red. I'm going to put this on all the armour panels quite loosely, leaving a few bits of brown showing through where I thought the shadows would be particularly strong. This was mostly where plates would join together, like on the thighs and the greaves. Once the first coat of red is on, I'm going to go back to the habit and do my next colour to bring it up to white. I'm using Grey Sear, which in retrospect would have been a good place to stop, however mistakes are about to be made. Back to the armour, and I'm going to put down my next tone up, which is Mephiston Red. I'm mostly going to stipple this on the raised areas, which I think gives it a more irregular, worn look. While that dries, I'm going to go back to my base and pick out some of the details. I went over the coiled cable with some grey to make a good base for some yellow later, and then it's onto the shell casings. I'm using Pro Acryl Rich Gold, which covers well and has a really nice satisfying colour to it. I'm just going to use a little bit to pick out the shell casings and help them stand out from the ground texture. For the cable, I'm using Avalon Sunset, which has excellent coverage, especially for a yellow. Back to the white, and I'm about to embark on a journey of disaster in my attempt to get a smooth coat of white. I mix up some Corax White with Lahmian Medium in an attempt to smooth it out a little bit. It worked, but it wasn't quite what I wanted yet. We're coming back to this. I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to put down some hazard stripes on the cable. It's a good low stakes opportunity to practice them here. With that done, I can move on to one of my favourite parts, which is actually bringing the pieces together. I'm going to pin the legs to the base so I don't have to worry about the glue gripping to the basing materials. It's quite simple. Drill a hole, glue some wire in, stick that through the base, and once it's where you want it, you bend the wire over and pop a bit more glue on the underside to help it stay in place. Another failed attempt at a smooth coat of white on the fabric. Should have left it at grey. It looked fine at grey. Next, I'm going to transfer the base and the legs onto a painting handle. I used to like the Games Workshop ones, but I made this one out of a cork and some magnets. It works fine. Time for the final layer of red, which is going to be Evil Sun's Scarlet. I'm going to use this for the parts of the armour which will be getting the most light. Things like the tops of the thighs and the shoulder pads. I think it helps to make a stronger contrast between the raised areas and the slightly darker areas. I was actually really pleased with how this came out on the shins and the calves, as I feel these have the most opportunity to really show contrast between light and dark on this particular model. I went back to the fabric one last time, this time with Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White. It's still not perfect, but it's close enough. Right, it's time to add some wear and tear. I'm using Lead Belcher, which is my favourite catch-all metallic colour, to go around the edges of the armour and add some scuffs and scrapes to parts I think would see a lot of abuse. I also use this to pick out some of the ornamentation like the fleur-de-lis on the knee and the little rivets, which are surprisingly satisfying to do. A quick bit of cleanup on the fabric and then I'm ready to glue the torso to the legs, which means I'll finally have something resembling a mini rather than just a collection of limbs superglued to a metal tree. Once the torso is on, I can go through the same steps with the Evil Sun's Scarlet. So far, I'm quite happy with how it's turning out. There's certainly something satisfying about seeing the model come together piece by piece. While the red dries, I'm going to work on the outside of the habits. In the pictures, I've seen it's a straight black with a fairly stark highlight, but I'm going to go for something a little more grey. My thinking is that there's really no way you can really go from pure black, so I'd rather have a darkish grey and pull from there. I'm going to use Eshin Grey to go over the raised areas of the fabric. Much like I did with the red, I want to leave the black in the deepest areas of the habit to create a bit more contrast. It's going to look ugly for a bit, but hopefully I can pull it together later. Leaving that for now, I'm going to use some grey cere to pick out the fleur-de-lis and the wings on the shoulder guards. I'll come back later with some white to highlight the edges. Time for a bit more lead belcher, this time on the torso details. I'm going to do those little pipes around her collar and then pick out the clasps on her battle corset. Before I come back up to do the Inquisition icons and the studs on the shoulders. After that, it's wear and tear time again, adding some scratches to the outside of the shoulder pads and along the rim of her gorget. I want this model to look like it's been through a fair bit of use over the centuries, and even the shiniest armour is going to look like a beat up old Ford Escort after a few days of purging heretics. Especially the Order of the Bloody Rose. From what I understand, those girls get stuck in where there's a fight to be had. I'm going to use some Dark Reaper to brighten up the grey on the habit, just a little bit. Literally just a quick pass to catch the topmost folds. And then, the weirdly satisfying task of painting the corset. I like to use Mornfang Brown over Rhinox Hide, which I think gives a nice rich colour with a little bit of a darker brown showing through on the deeper recesses. I like to stipple this on as I think it makes it look a little bit more natural and worn. I'm also going to use some Rhinox Hide to edge some of the scratches on the armour. Then I get to painstakingly pick out all the little studs on the habit with some lead belcher. Very satisfying once it's done. Gold for the Imperial icon, and then a nice bright silver to get the studs again. I normally use Stormhost silver, but the pot I had is completely separated, so I use some Pro Acryl instead. I also use this to hit the edges of the gold icon to make it look a little bit more battle worn. I'm quickly going to use some Death Corps drab to do the grenade at her belt, and then highlight that with some Castellian green. In an attempt to smooth out the grey I used on the fabric, I'm going to mix some Eshin grey pretty much 1-to-1 with some Lamia medium to create a sort of glaze, which I'm going to put across the whole surface to help tie the grey and the black together a little bit more smoothly. I think it more or less worked, but also weathering is going to hide a lot of my sins, hopefully. The same sort of steps are happening for the arms, black with grey highlights, and then I'm going to set them aside to dry. I'm going to go through all the metal bits on the backpack, or at least the things I think should be metal. I'm not really sure what the little ring is for, but I think it should be metal. A little bit of plastic glue and on it goes. Now for the bolter. I'm going to start with lead belcher and clean it up with some black, and while I'm here, I might as well get the robot arm done too. I actually love that Games Workshop sculpted some of these to have prosthetic limbs. It's actually something I'd love to see in more kits. I've stippled on some Dark Reaper to help brighten up the gun so it's not just flat black. Once that's done, I can glue the arms in place. Now, I've edited this to look like it's all boom boom done, but in actuality it was quite fiddly, especially attaching the left hand to the bolter, but with a bit of patience and a steady hand you could get them to work. I used a bit of Castellax bronze to add some details to the prosthetic arm, and then some brass scorpion for the shell casings in the bolter. Even though I was going to do an unhelmed sister, it always bothers me that they don't still have the helmet. So I'm going to quickly go through all the armor steps for this helmet and then pin it onto the model later. I also saw this as an opportunity to test out highlighting red with orange, as I've never tried that before, and the helmet's a small scale way to try that out. I mixed some Evil Sunz Scarlet with some Uriel Yellow to get something between the two that I liked, and used that to go around the edges. It came out really well, so I used some on the shoulder armor and for a tiny highlight on the backpack too. I used a bit of grey cere to highlight the bolter and then added a little green dot for what I think is a targeting sensor. Right, there's no more putting it off now. I've got to do a face. If you're going to do a sister's army, you're going to have to do some faces. Firstly, I'm going to paint the collar black to look like it's part of an undersuit, and then I'm going to use Bugman's Glow on top of a base coat of grey cere. After that, I lightly brush on some Kislev flesh onto the cheeks and the nose before using Flayed One flesh for the most raised areas. I've recently been adding some corn red to do a bit of lipstick. I know that they're probably not going to bother with makeup in the grimdark, but a tiny bit of colour I think helps it to not just be a skin-coloured blob on top of armour. I decided to do dark hair instead of the traditional white. I started with black and then layered on ash and grey. After that I used some grey cere to pick out a few accents. The head gets glued on and then there's a few last minute touch-ups once it's in place. I'm actually really happy with how this has turned out. It's time for optional extras now with some weathering. Essentially, I just used a dark earthy brown and a light earthy brown to simulate dirt in various states of drying on the cloth and armour with a dry brush. I think for this I used Thondia brown and Steel Legion drab, but basically it's dark brown and light brown. I used a tiny bit of Nuln oil to darken up the recesses on the robot arm, but overall I actually didn't use washes on the majority of this process. I did a quick pass of Warpstone Glow and Moot Green on the little screen looking thing on her backpack, and I think I'm done. Tell a lie, I did use some basing material I made from crushed up bark to add some texture to the base. Okay, now I'm done. Overall, I really enjoyed this colour scheme. I thought the red was going to be a bit garish, but I think it actually comes out quite well. These models have so much detail that's actually quite satisfying to paint. I think these are some of the best sculpts Games Workshop's done in a long time. They're a bit dainty, but there's such a nice flow to their design that I really enjoy them. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Please feel free to like, comment and subscribe. I'm going to try and do videos for each of the major orders, and hopefully a few other projects that I've been wanting to do for a while. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you on the next one.